Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Catholic League Forum. Today we're going to continue our journey of exploring Bill's new book, The Truth About Clergy Sexual Abuse. Now, Bill, today, as reading through your book, one of the things that really jumped out to me was you've got a number of chapters about homosexuals in the book. What role do you think they played then? You really build it up, and so I was hoping to give you an opportunity today to explore that.
Sure, thank you very much. I've said for years that while most of the molesting priests were gay, most gay priests are not molesters. I hope people understand the difference here. You can't talk about the problem in the Catholic Church, which existed mostly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, without talking about the role of homosexuality. The data are clear. 81% of the victims are male, and 78%, about the same figure, are post-pubescent. The John Jay study found out about 3.5% of the priests who molested a minor were engaged in pedophilia. That's about ages 10 and below, as if you look at the standard by the American Pediatric Society. So we're talking about adolescence, basically. That's homosexuality. That's the driving question here. Now, I do raise the question, does homosexuality cause someone to abuse a minor? And the answer is no. That's simply false. But if homosexuals are overrepresented, and not just within the Catholic Church, if you look at the literature, admittedly, there's not as much as there should be because the subject is taboo, and we live in a cancel culture. But quite frankly, homosexuals are disproportionately represented amongst those who abuse minors. If you look at the literature on that, it's very, very clear. So the question I'm saying is this: if you find a disproportionate segment of the population is responsible for a large percent of the problem, there's got to be something in between that accounts for it. I make the argument that while being a homosexual does not cause you to abuse anyone, it is also true that homosexuals are more likely to be emotionally and sexually immature than heterosexuals. And it is that immaturity which is linked to the sexual abuse of minors. That's my argument. It's kind of an intervening variable. We know, for example, that, to take an example, that the Irish are overrepresented and Native Americans amongst alcoholics. Being a Native American or an Irishman doesn't make you an alcoholic. Something must explain that. The Chinese are more likely to be, in this country, to be smokers and to be gamblers. Something has to explain that. I offer those examples in the book and get into the historical background. There's always some kind of intervening variable. And that's what we have to look into. Look, I didn't come up with this idea. If you look at the John Jay study, the molesting priests, many of them admit that it's immaturity. I suffer from immaturity. Freud recognized this. Jung recognized this. Homosexuals are more likely to be stunted in their psychological development. They reach a certain stage, maybe of adolescence, and they don't grow beyond that. Therefore, they associate more with youngsters, and that's what it accounts for. I've often said to people, look, if you see in a priest rectory or in his room that he's got all kinds of Mickey Mouse dolls and what, that should be a tip-off, okay? They're not able to identify as an adult man because they became psychologically stunted. So in terms of the psychosocial sexual development. So that is a problem there. Again, so how do you deal with it? Well, I mean, I think the church has done very well by screening more carefully about this issue. I'm not here to demonize anyone. I am simply saying that if you have a bunch of straight guys and they are living with and not just working with females, you're going to have some problems. They've seen it in the military, haven't they? So why would we find it so shocking to find that if homosexuals who are more likely to be emotionally and sexually immature, when they're around so many males, either of the same age or younger age, that they're going to act out? And as I mentioned, I think once before about Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons, he's never met any homosexual whom he's treated for molesting a minor who wasn't also involved with other homosexuals. So we've got to own up to this problem, and to put your head in the sand and blame clericalism or opportunity thesis or whatever is simply a dodge.
No, good points there, Bill. Now, one of the things that you've been harping on as we've been going through this series is the heyday for molesting priests was the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, you're clearly the expert on this, but one of the things I think is very interesting in your book is you point out that this is the exact same time as the sexual revolution. Can you explain how the sexual revolution also impacted the molesting problem?
You know, we live in a world where sociologists are asked to look at the root causes. When you looked at the urban riots in the 1960s, the black riots that took place, you had to look at the root cause of discrimination, poverty, racism, and things of that nature to explain the anger. Well, there are root causes here too. Why did we have a sexual revolution in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? That's a subject for another day. I've written about that in the past. But the fact is, the Catholic Church is not like the Amish, okay? We are very much a part of society. We're not isolated from it. The cultural winds that took place in the 60s, the sexual revolution, affected every institution that's part of the dominant culture, and we certainly are part of it. Now, the Catholic Church should have resisted it. Instead, they dropped their guard. That's why the 1970s, by far, the worst, most decadent decade in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States of America. Pope Benedict XVI, he talked about the sexual revolution, and the John Jay researchers do. As a sociologist, I can tell you, you'd be delinquent not to reference the sexual revolution. This doesn't mean that the bishops enabled get a pass. This doesn't mean that the homosexual priest who did most of the abuse gets a pass. It simply means you have to look at the milieu. You have to look at the environment, the cultural norms and values which gave rise to this. And by thrashing the John Jay researchers on this, that's absurd. And by attacking Pope Benedict XVI, that's also absurd. You know, I got to say one other thing here in relation to homosexuality. The John Jay study did show it's male-on-male sex, yet they concluded that, well, in fact, you know, the role of homosexuality really doesn't figure in here. But wait a minute, you admitted it's male-on-male sex of adolescents. How did they come to that conclusion? This is where I differ with them. They said, well, not all the molesting priests identify as a homosexual. Well, excuse me, self-perception is important, and self-identity is an interesting psychological variable, but it's not dispositive. Reality is not based on perceptions of something necessarily, not when the perception is wrong. We're looking at behavior, okay? So I don't care. If a homosexual priest calls himself a straight person, are we going to argue that we had a straight heterosexual problem in the Catholic Church? No. So that's another dodge, and the dodge was played there by the John Jay researchers. They know better. They know it's homosexual priests. Thank God the homosexual priests didn't consider themselves to be giraffes. Otherwise, given their logic, we'd be talking about bestiality. That's how absurd this whole thing can become.
I feel you, Bill. All right, well, thank you, dear viewer, for joining us today. And please make sure to click the like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks.